1816. That is the year the official story keeps returning to, because it is the year they can explain. The eruption has a name, the ash cloud has measurements, the crop failures have records. Mount Tambora erupted in the Dutch East Indies, the temperatures fell, the rivers froze, and history filed the event away beneath a label simple enough for textbooks to repeat without resistance: the year without a summer. A volcanic winter, a climate anomaly, case closed. But the closer the original records are read in sequence, not the summaries written decades later, but the journals themselves, the shipping logs, the private weather observations stored in regional historical societies and provincial archives, the more the explanation begins to feel incomplete. Not false, incomplete, because the cold appears before the timeline says it should. A physician in Vermont described the winter air as strangely fixed months before the famous summer frosts arrived. Clergymen in Northern Europe recorded the same unnatural stillness in language that did not match ordinary seasonal hardship. Dutch observers, French observers, German observers, separated by borders, languages, and political systems, described not simply colder weather, but a different quality of cold entirely. Something settled, that was the phrase that kept returning. And while governments across continents struggled to explain collapsing harvests and frozen rivers, another anomaly was already sitting quietly inside libraries and naval archives: maps. Maps drawn centuries before modern Antarctic expeditions, showing coastlines that should not have been known. Not vague southern landmasses invented for balance, detailed coastlines matching the Antarctica beneath the ice itself. That is where the official explanation begins to fracture. Because if Antarctica had remained buried beneath permanent ice for millions of years, then who mapped the land underneath it centuries before sonar, seismic imaging, or polar exploration even existed? And why do the dates surrounding those maps begin clustering around the exact same decade the old world record itself starts changing? The accepted chronology begins in April of 1815 on the island of Sumbawa. Tambora erupts. The atmosphere fills with sulfur aerosols. Sunlight weakens across the northern hemisphere, and the following year descends into agricultural collapse. The mechanism is real. Ice core samples confirm it. Contemporary newspapers confirm it. Mortality records confirm it. Entire regions across Europe and North America recorded failed harvests, livestock death, frozen waterways, and sudden food scarcity. Nothing about that part is invented. What becomes difficult is the timing. The volcanic explanation works cleanly only if the cold intensifies gradually through late 1815 before reaching its peak during the summer of 1816. That is the sequence climatology depends on. But the private journals do not fully cooperate with that sequence. They begin describing abnormalities too early, and more importantly, they describe them with unusual consistency across large geographic distances. In New England, snowfall arrived in June. In Switzerland and parts of Germany, grain prices surged beyond what local shortages alone should have produced. The Hudson froze heavily enough for loaded wagons to cross. Lake Geneva froze. Official climatology explains each event through generalized cooling, and technically, that explanation remains available. But the problem is not whether volcanic cooling existed. The problem is distribution, different watersheds, different local climates, different atmospheric systems, yet the descriptions repeat the same language. Observers separated by oceans kept recording a sensation that felt unnaturally uniform. Not violent weather, not unstable weather. Stable cold. One Vermont physician, whose record surfaced through a regional historical society in the 1960s after being donated by surviving family descendants, wrote that the atmosphere itself felt settled into place, as though movement inside the air had stopped. He was not attempting scientific theory, he was simply documenting sensation, the way educated rural observers often did during the early 19th century. But he had maintained weather journals for nearly 2 decades, and he recognized the difference between severe winter and something unfamiliar. The official account rarely engages directly with those descriptions, because individually they prove nothing. Any single observation can be dismissed as perception, exaggeration, or emotional interpretation shaped by hardship. But when identical phrasing appears across multiple countries, the pattern becomes harder to ignore, and the pattern does not end with weather. The second anomaly was already waiting inside Renaissance cartography centuries before Tambora erupted. Most people encounter the Piri Reis map only through simplified internet reproductions stripped of context, but the original document contains marginal notes explaining that it was compiled from older source materials, including charts supposedly dating back to the era of Alexander. Whether every annotation is authentic is less important than the problem the map itself creates, because the southern coastline it depicts resembles Antarctica too closely. Not modern Antarctica covered beneath massive ice shelves, but sections of the coastline hidden below the ice itself. The same subglacial contours later confirmed through 20th century seismic mapping. The standard explanation invokes terra australis, the hypothetical southern continent Renaissance geographers imagined for balance, and in fairness, many old maps absolutely did invent theoretical southern landmasses. But the Piri Reis coastline contains specific bays and protrusions that researchers have struggled to reduce to coincidence for over a century. That is why mainstream responses almost always retreat towards source transmission instead of direct denial. They argue the Ottoman admiral copied older materials. They argue fragments from lost traditions accumulated through generations of cartographic duplication. But once that argument is accepted, another question immediately appears beneath it. Who created the older sources? Because a copying chain does not solve the anomaly, it moves the anomaly backward in time. The Piri Reis map survives because it was rediscovered inside the Topkapi Palace archives in the early 20th century, but it is not isolated. That detail matters more than most summaries admit. A single impossible map can be dismissed as artistic imagination, damaged interpretation, or coincidence shaped by modern pattern recognition. Multiple maps repeating the same impossible coastline become more difficult to absorb into accident. 33 years after Piri Reis completed his chart, Oronce Fine produced another world map in France, depicting a southern continent with startling specificity, not a vague balancing mass beneath Africa and South America, but a structured landform containing rivers, mountain divisions, and coastline indentations corresponding with areas later identified beneath Antarctic ice. Researchers examining the map across the 20th century repeatedly returned to the same uncomfortable conclusion. The drainage systems appear closer to subglacial Antarctica than to speculative Renaissance geometry. Again, the official explanation does not fully deny the resemblance. It reframes it. Cartographers copied earlier traditions. Ancient geographical concepts survived through transmission. Lost materials informed later maps. But every version of that defense quietly preserves the central contradiction. If the maps inherited accurate geographic information, then accurate geographic information existed before modern Antarctic exploration. And that creates a timing problem historians rarely want to approach directly. Wilkes departed in the late 1830s. Ross followed. Dumont d'Urville was already moving southward. These expeditions entered public memory as the great 19th century encounters with Antarctica. Yet centuries earlier, mapmakers had already sketched coastlines those expeditions themselves struggled to approach. The chronology feels inverted. Discovery appears to arrive after knowledge. That inversion becomes stranger when placed beside another cartographic disappearance, unfolding during the same historical window. For more than 2 centuries, European maps repeatedly labeled a massive territorial region as Tartary, Grand Tartary, or the Tartarian Empire. The terminology varied by nation and decade, but the pattern remained remarkably consistent. The designation stretched across enormous portions of Central Asia and Siberia, appearing not only in fringe atlases, but in respected encyclopedias and commercial cartographic publications used across Europe. The 1771 edition of Encyclopaedia Britannica described Tartary as a vast geopolitical reality containing cities, populations, trade routes, and administrative regions. Mapmakers across multiple nations continued using the term deep into the late 18th century. Then, within the opening decades of the 19th century, it vanishes, not gradually. That distinction is critical. Empires normally dissolve through traceable fragmentation. Borders shift, wars occur, diplomatic treaties redefine territories, administrative names transition over generations. The Ottoman Empire faded slowly. The Polish partitions generated immense diplomatic paperwork. The Mughal decline unfolded through identifiable succession and colonial intervention. Tartary simply disappears from the map record. The designation stops appearing with a suddenness that does not resemble ordinary geopolitical change, and the silence surrounding that disappearance may be the most unsettling part of all. There is no widely recognized treaty dissolving a Tartarian political structure because official history insists no unified structure existed in the first place. Yet cartographers across centuries repeatedly treated it as something concrete enough to name. That contradiction alone would be curious, but the timing clusters beside everything else, the freezing events, the agricultural collapse, the surge in Antarctic expeditions, the weather anomalies recorded before the Tambora timeline fully accounts for them, the architectural disruptions emerging across Northern Hemisphere cities, all of it concentrates around the same narrow historical corridor between approximately 1810 and 1820. Individually, each anomaly can survive dismissal. Together, they begin forming a pattern, and patterns become harder to ignore when they appear physically inside cities, because the strongest evidence connected to this period is not hidden inside archives at all. It is buried directly beneath the streets. Across Europe, North America, and sections of Asia, early 19th century stone structures exhibit the same strange characteristic. Their lower floors sit beneath present street level, windows begin where sidewalks now exist, doorways descend downward instead of rising above grade. Excavation work performed during 20th century utility projects repeatedly uncovered earlier surfaces several feet below the modern city line. Chicago recorded it, St. Louis recorded it, Edinburgh recorded it. Municipal engineering surveys acknowledged buried structural layers that did not fully correspond with documented construction phases. Mainstream urban historians explain the phenomenon through gradual accumulation, resurfacing, debris deposition, and redevelopment over long periods of occupation. That explanation remains technically available in older European cities, but it weakens dramatically in locations officially developed only decades earlier. Because some cities displaying these buried ground floors supposedly lacked the centuries required to create such depth naturally. That is the part the mainstream explanation struggles to stabilize. But all are said, but not the existence of buried architecture at isolated sites, but the repetition of the same structural condition across widely separated cities whose official occupation timelines do not extend far enough backward to explain the observed accumulation. When excavation crews uncovered lower entrances and compacted material layers beneath 19th century streets, the discoveries were usually catalogued as local engineering irregularities, individually manageable, collectively forgettable. But viewed together, they suggest deposition on a scale larger than ordinary urban development. The material composition matters here. In several documented cases, the compacted layers uncovered beneath street level resembled flood deposit or atmospheric sediment more closely than ordinary civic debris. That distinction appears repeatedly inside engineering notes and survey descriptions from the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The language is cautious, but the implication remains visible beneath the technical phrasing. Something arrived rapidly enough to interrupt earlier occupation surfaces. And according to the alternative reconstruction that developed quietly outside academic institutions during the 20th century, the likely window for that interruption falls between approximately 1810 and 1820. The same decade again. What emerged after that decade was a different architectural narrative entirely. Massive stone civic structures already standing across Europe and North America became reassigned to newly forming national identities. Buildings of extraordinary scale and precision suddenly acquired official construction histories connected to colonial governments, early Republican administrations, or Napoleonic reconstruction programs. Yet, when researchers examined some of those records closely, the logistical details often became strangely vague. Labor totals insufficient for the documented scale, material procurement records lacking specificity, construction timelines compressed beyond what contemporary industrial capacity should comfortably support. None of this proves the buildings were inherited from a lost civilization. That leap exceeds the evidence. But the bureaucratic record surrounding several major projects does not possess the consistency expected from 19th century administrative systems otherwise obsessed with paperwork and accounting. And once that inconsistency is noticed, another question emerges beneath it. Why do so many official explanations surrounding this period feel structurally incomplete rather than fully false? That distinction matters. The Tambora eruption happened. Antarctica exists beneath ice. Urban redevelopment occurred. Cartographers copied older sources. None of those things are fabricated. The unease begins when independent explanations start overlapping too neatly, while still leaving the same unresolved gaps behind. A volcanic winter explains cooling, but not fully, the early atmospheric descriptions appearing before the expected peak. Cartographic tradition explains copied coastlines, but not the origin of the accurate source material itself. Urban accumulation explains buried lower floors in ancient cities, but not identical patterns in comparatively young settlements. Political transition explains changing borders, but not the abrupt removal of a continental designation used consistently for generations. The official narrative answers each anomaly separately. The historical record presents them simultaneously. That is why the year 1816 refuses to remain only a climate event. It behaves more like a pivot point, a decade where multiple systems change together. Geographic terminology shifts, architectural continuity breaks, weather patterns destabilize. Exploration priorities suddenly intensify. Governments across hostile nations begin responding to the same crisis at the same time. And beneath all of it sits Antarctica, not merely as a frozen continent, but as a chronological problem. Because if subglacial coastlines appeared in map traditions centuries before modern exploration, then either earlier civilizations possessed geographic knowledge no longer accounted for in the accepted timeline, or coincidence somehow reproduced the same impossible coastline repeatedly across generations of cartographers working from unknown sources. Most historians understandably choose coincidence, mixed with speculative geography, because the alternative opens a chain of questions with no comfortable stopping point. Who created the original source maps? When were they created? What conditions existed when those coastlines became visible? And why does the historical window surrounding 1816 align so closely with both climatic disruption and the disappearance of older cartographic realities from the public record? Even the language surrounding Antarctica changes during this era. Earlier maps often depict southern land differently from the rigidly frozen continent modern audiences imagine. Some portray navigable coastlines. Others imply terrain visibility inconsistent with permanent ice coverage stretching back millions of years. Defenders of the orthodox timeline argue these are symbolic inventions, imaginative geography filling unknown space. Again, technically possible. But the accumulation of possible explanations begins to resemble something else after a while. Not certainty, not proof, pressure. Pressure building inside the historical record itself. And pressure inside a historical system usually produces the same response: compression, simplification. A single explanation broad enough to absorb multiple contradictions at once. Tambora became that explanation. It provided governments, historians, and later educational systems with a coherent mechanism capable of organizing famine, cold, migration, and social disruption beneath one acceptable narrative framework. Volcanic winter, atmospheric ash, climatic instability. But coherent explanations are not always complete explanations, because the unresolved details remain scattered behind it. The physicians describing unfamiliar cold before the expected timeline. The maps preserving coastlines no expedition should have known. The disappearance of Tartary from the cartographic record without ordinary geopolitical transition. The buried architecture appearing across multiple continents inside the same narrow historical corridor. None of these anomalies independently overturn accepted history. Together, they create something harder to dismiss, a pattern of discontinuity. And once that pattern becomes visible, 1816 stops looking like an isolated disaster. It starts looking like the moment an older world ended, and a different narrative replaced it. The official story still works well enough for classrooms. Tambora erupted. The atmosphere cooled. Crops failed. History moved forward. And if the record ended there, the contradictions surrounding 1816 would probably remain buried inside scattered archives and forgotten engineering reports no one reads anymore. But the record does not end there. The maps remain. The buried foundations remain. The unexplained timing remains. And perhaps most unsettling of all, the language remains. Observers across continents describing a kind of cold they struggled to name, as though they were documenting not merely weather, but the arrival of a different condition entirely. That does not prove Antarctica thawed recently. It does not prove a hidden civilization mapped the southern continent. It does not prove Tartary was erased by deliberate coordination. The evidence does not reach that far, and pretending otherwise would weaken the investigation instead of strengthening it. But the gaps are real, and once those gaps become visible, the accepted chronology begins feeling less like a complete historical account and more like a structure built carefully around missing pieces. So the question remains exactly where it began. If Antarctica truly remained buried beneath permanent ice for millions of years, then why were its coastlines already appearing on maps centuries before modern exploration ever arrived?